I still remember the exact moment I knew my marriage was over. It wasn't during a screaming fight or some dramatic revelation. It was on a random Saturday morning in 2019 when I was folding laundry and realized I hadn't really looked at my husband in months. Not really looked at him. Somewhere along the way, Camilla Arnold had convinced herself she was settling, and that realization would cost me everything I actually valued. My name is Camilla. I'm 38 now, and I live in Denver, where the mountains remind you daily that there are bigger things than your problems. I was married to Ray for 8 years before I torched it all for what I thought was an upgrade. He wasn't a bad husband. Actually, he was probably too good for me, though I didn't see it that way at the time. Ray is 41, works in HVAC repair, and has this genuine laugh that makes everyone around him smile. People always told me how lucky I was to have found someone so solid, so dependable. But back then, I heard solid and thought boring. I heard dependable and thought predictable. What an idiot I was. When we married in 2011, I was working as a medical receptionist at a busy clinic downtown. The pay wasn't amazing, but I liked the fast pace and dealing with people. Ray had been doing heating and cooling work for about 5 years by then, and while it wasn't glamorous, he was good at it, and there was always demand. We weren't wealthy, but we managed. We had a small house in a decent neighborhood, 2 cars that ran most of the time, and enough left over for dinner out once a week. Looking back, we had everything we needed. But I started wanting more. The wanting crept in slowly. It started with little things. Seeing my friends post vacation photos on Facebook, watching my sister buy a bigger house, noticing which couples seemed to have more excitement in their lives. Ray seemed content with our routine: work, home, weekend projects, occasional barbecues with friends. He'd crack open a Coors Light after fixing the neighbor's furnace and act like he'd won the lottery. That contentment started to irritate me. While I was researching ways to increase our income, taking online courses to maybe move into medical administration, Ray would be in the garage tinkering with some old motorcycle he'd bought for $50. He had these hobbies that cost money, but never seemed to make any. When I'd bring up our financial goals, he'd nod and agree, but nothing would change. The truth is, I was probably harder on our budget than he was. I've always had a weakness for clothes, books, little home decor items that caught my eye. Ray never said much about my spending, but I could see him mentally calculating when I'd come home with shopping bags. He'd just shake his head with this patient smile that made me feel like a child being indulged. The real problem started around year 5. I began to feel like we were roommates instead of lovers. Ray would come home covered in dust and grease, shower, eat dinner while watching the news, and fall asleep on the couch by 9. On weekends, he'd either be working on some project or helping his brother move furniture or fix something. He was always doing something practical, something useful, but never anything that felt romantic or special. I started to resent his predictability. I knew exactly what he'd order at every restaurant, which TV shows he'd want to watch, how he'd react to any given situation. There were no surprises anymore, no butterflies, no moments that made me think, this is the man I fell in love with. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd listen, really listen. But his solutions were always so Ray. We could take a weekend trip, he'd suggest, or maybe we should join that couple's bowling league. These weren't bad ideas, but they felt like more of the same comfortable, safe existence that was slowly suffocating me. The physical aspect of our marriage had become routine too. Ray wasn't unattractive, but he'd gotten comfortable. He'd gained maybe 20 pounds since we married, mostly settling around his middle. His hair was thinning, and he'd started wearing the same 3 ratty t-shirts every weekend. I kept thinking, is this it? Is this what the rest of my life looks like? Meanwhile, I was still trying. I worked out regularly, kept up with my appearance, read articles about keeping marriages fresh. But it felt like I was doing all the work, while Ray just coasted on the assumption that we were fine. Everything changed when I met Joaquin at a medical conference in 2018. I'd started attending these events as part of my professional development, and he was there representing some pharmaceutical company. He was 44, divorced, impeccably dressed, and had this energy that just drew people in. During a break between sessions, we ended up talking by the coffee station. He was funny, well-traveled, and had opinions about things I'd never heard anyone discuss at length. Art, wine, international politics. After 20 minutes of conversation, I felt more intellectually stimulated than I had in months at home. "You should come to the networking reception tonight," he said, handing me his card. "It's usually pretty boring, but maybe we could make it interesting." I went home that evening buzzing with excitement. Ray was in the garage working on that motorcycle again, grease under his fingernails, completely absorbed in whatever mechanical problem he was solving. When I tried to tell him about the conference, about the interesting people I'd met, he nodded absently while wrestling with some stubborn bolt. "That's great, babe," he said without looking up. Sounds like it was worth the registration fee. That was it. No curiosity about what I'd learned, no interest in my excitement. Just a practical assessment that we'd gotten our money's worth. I went to the networking reception. Joaquin and I talked for hours that night. He wanted to know everything, what I thought about healthcare policy, what books I was reading, what I wanted out of life. When was the last time anyone had asked me what I wanted out of life? Over the following weeks, we started texting. Nothing inappropriate at first, just follow-ups about the conference, sharing articles we thought the other would find interesting. But gradually, the conversations became more personal. He'd ask about my day, remember details from previous conversations, make me laugh with observations about the absurdities of corporate life. I found myself looking forward to his messages in a way that should have been a red flag. When my phone buzzed, I'd hope it was him. When Ray was talking, part of my mind would be composing responses to Joaquin's latest text. I was emotionally checking out of my marriage and didn't even realize it. Joaquin would send me photos from his business trips, beautiful restaurants, interesting architecture, wine bars with atmosphere. His life seemed so much more dynamic than mine. While Ray was fixing Mrs. Patterson's water heater, Joaquin was closing deals over expensive dinners in cities I'd never visited. I started to feel embarrassed about my own life. When Joaquin asked what I'd done over the weekend, I couldn't bring myself to say Ray and I had spent Saturday at Home Depot, looking at ceiling fans, and Sunday watching football. Instead, I'd focus on the one interesting thing, maybe a book I'd read or a restaurant we'd tried. The more I talked to Joaquin, the more Ray's flaws seemed magnified. Ray would come home tired and want to just relax, while Joaquin was texting me about art galleries and theater productions. Ray wore the same Carhartt work clothes every day, while Joaquin always looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. I started noticing things about Ray that had never bothered me before. The way he'd fall asleep in his recliner during movies, how he'd get genuinely excited about finding a good deal on spark plugs, the fact that his idea of dressing up was putting on khakis instead of jeans. When Joaquin invited me to lunch during one of his visits to Denver, I said yes without hesitation. We met at this trendy place downtown that Ray would have called overpriced for what you get. Joaquin ordered wine with lunch and talked about a client who collected rare guitars. I felt sophisticated, appreciated, seen. "Your husband is lucky to have someone so intelligent and beautiful," he said at one point, and I felt my face flush. Ray hadn't called me beautiful in years. He'd say I looked nice when I dressed up, or that he liked my hair when I got it cut, but nothing that made me feel genuinely desired. I went home from that lunch feeling alive in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Ray was fixing our garbage disposal when I walked in, his head stuck under the sink, muttering about whoever had installed it wrong the first time. "How was lunch with your work friend?" he called out, his voice muffled. "Fine," I said, and went to change clothes. My heart still racing from Joaquin's attention. The affair became physical 3 months later. Joaquin was in town for another conference, and this time, he suggested we meet for drinks instead of lunch. I knew what I was doing when I put on my best dress and spent an hour on my makeup. I knew what I was doing when I agreed to go up to his hotel room just to see the view from the top floor. Afterward, lying in bed next to this man who wasn't my husband, I waited for the guilt to hit. But instead, I felt vindicated. This was what I'd been missing. This was what I deserved. Ray hadn't made me feel this way in years. Attractive, desirable, worth pursuing. Joaquin was different from Ray in every way that mattered to me then. He was worldly where Ray was simple, sophisticated where Ray was plain, ambitious where Ray was content. When he talked about his goals, they involved expansion, growth, success. When Ray talked about the future, it was usually about finally finishing the bathroom renovation or maybe taking a fishing trip with his dad. I started living two lives. At home, I was Ray's wife, going through the motions of our comfortable routine. But in my head, and increasingly in my heart, I was somewhere else. I was with someone who made me feel special, who saw potential in me that I'd forgotten I had. The guilt was there, but I rationalized it away. Ray and I had grown apart, I told myself. We wanted different things. I deserved to be happy, didn't I? I deserved someone who excited me, who challenged me, who made me feel alive. Ray found out 6 months into the affair, not because I confessed I was too much of a coward for that, but because Joaquin sent a text while I was in the shower and Ray saw it when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Missing you already. Last night was incredible. When I came out of the bathroom, Ray was sitting on the edge of the bed holding my phone, his face completely blank. "Who's Joaquin?" he asked quietly. My stomach dropped. I could have lied, should have lied, but the look on his face told me he already knew. "Ray, Just tell me the truth, Camila, please." So I did. Not everything, but enough. I told him about meeting Joaquin, about how we'd connected, about how I'd been feeling in our marriage. I made it sound like it had just happened, like I'd gotten swept up in something I couldn't control. Ray listened without interrupting, his hands folded in his lap, his face getting paler with every word. "How long?" he finally asked. 6 months. He closed his eyes. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air between us. I should have said no. I should have begged forgiveness, promised to end it, fought for my marriage. Instead, I heard myself say, "I think I do." Ray nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. "Okay," he said. "I guess that's it then." He got up, grabbed some clothes from the dresser, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" I asked. "To my brother's. I'll come back for my stuff when you're at work." And that was it. No screaming, no begging, no dramatic confrontation. Just Ray being Ray. Practical, straightforward, devastatingly honest about what my betrayal meant. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Ray was fair to the point of being generous, taking only what was his and making sure I could afford to keep the house if I wanted it. His lawyer kept pushing for a more aggressive approach, but Ray wouldn't hear it. "She made her choice," I heard him tell his brother when they came to get his tools from the garage. "I just want this over with." I kept waiting for him to fight for us, to ask me to reconsider, to make some grand gesture that would prove he cared enough to compete for me. But Ray wasn't a grand gesture kind of man. He never had been. He showed love through action, through consistency, through being there day after day. I'd mistaken that steadiness for indifference, and by the time I realized my error, it was too late. The last time I saw him was at the final court hearing. He looked different, thinner, more tired, but also somehow lighter, like a weight had been lifted. He nodded at me politely, shook hands with my lawyer, and walked out of the courthouse without looking back. 3 months after the divorce, I moved to Phoenix to be with Joaquin. He'd gotten a promotion that required relocating, and it seemed like the perfect opportunity for us to start fresh. Finally, I thought, I was going to have the life I deserved. And for a while, it was everything I'd imagined. Joaquin's new position came with a significant salary increase, which meant dinners at nice restaurants, weekend trips to Sedona, a beautiful apartment with a view of the mountains. I found work at a high-end medical spa, which felt more glamorous than my old job at the clinic. Joaquin was attentive and romantic in ways Ray had never been. He brought me flowers for no reason, swing-planned surprise date nights, told me I was beautiful every day. He introduced me to his colleagues as his gorgeous girlfriend and seemed genuinely proud to have me on his arm at work functions. I felt validated. This was what it was supposed to feel like, I told myself. This was real love, not the comfortable companionship I'd had with Ray. When Joaquin touched me, I felt electric. When he talked about our future together, I could picture it clearly: travel, success, a life full of experiences and excitement. For about a year, I was genuinely happy. Or at least, I was what I thought happy was supposed to feel like. The first sign of trouble should have been how Joaquin talked about his ex-wife. According to him, she'd been needy, clingy, unable to appreciate his ambition. She'd wanted him to stay home more, to prioritize family time over career advancement. She'd been, in his words, small-minded about what life could offer. At the time, I agreed with him. Ray had been similar, I thought, content with a limited vision of what our life could be. But as I got to know Joaquin better, I started to see other sides of his personality. He was charming, but only when it served him. With waitstaff, store clerks, anyone he considered beneath him, he could be dismissive or outright rude. When I called him on it, he'd laugh it off. "I just don't have patience for incompetence," he'd say. He was generous with me, but it came with expectations. The flowers were lovely, but they were also a way of showing off to his colleagues. The nice dinners were less about us and more about maintaining an image. When I suggested we have a quiet night at home sometimes, he'd look at me like I'd suggested we move to a cave. Most troubling was how he talked about other people in his life. Former friends who'd failed to evolve, colleagues who couldn't keep up, family members who didn't understand success. I started to realize that in Joaquin's world, people were either useful or they weren't. And when they stopped being useful, they stopped mattering. By our second year together, the romance was fading. Joaquin still brought flowers, but they felt obligatory. He still planned nice evenings, but they felt more like items on a checklist than genuine expressions of love. When I tried to talk to him about deeper things, my concerns about my aging parents, my doubts about the direction of my career, my feelings about not having children, his eyes would glaze over. "You worry too much," he'd say, the same way Ray used to tell me to relax. But when Ray said it, it came from a place of love, a desire to ease my stress. When Joaquin said it, it felt like dismissal. I started to notice that Joaquin's attention was conditional. When I was dressed up and socially on, he was affectionate and proud. When I was tired, stressed, or just wanting to be comfortable, he seemed less interested. He never said anything directly, but I felt the shift in his energy. Ray had loved me in old sweatpants and a messy bun. He loved me when I was sick, when I was cranky, when I was at my most ordinary. Joaquin seemed to love the idea of me, the version of me that fit into his lifestyle, but not necessarily me as a complete person. The end started with a text message I wasn't supposed to see. Joaquin was in the shower, and his phone kept buzzing on the kitchen counter. Finally, annoyed by the noise, I glanced at it to see if it was something urgent. The messages were from someone named Miranda, and they were definitely not work-related. "Can't wait to see you again soon. Last week was amazing." My hands shook as I scrolled up through the conversation. It went back months. Flirtatious messages, intimate photos, plans to meet up during Joaquin's business trips. The same kind of messages he used to send me when I was married to Ray. When he came out of the bathroom, I was sitting on the couch with his phone in my hands. "Having an affair?" I asked, proud of how steady my voice sounded. Joaquin didn't even look surprised. He just sighed, like I'd discovered something mildly inconvenient. "It's not what you think," he said, but his heart wasn't in the denial. "It's exactly what I think. Who is she?" "Someone I met at a conference. Look, Camila, these things happen. It doesn't change how I feel about you." Those words, "these things happen," hit me like a physical blow. Because I'd said something similar to Ray. I'd acted like my affair was something that had happened to me, rather than something I'd chosen. "Are there others?" I asked. The pause before he answered told me everything I needed to know. That night, after Joaquin had gone to sleep like nothing had happened, I sat in the living room thinking about karma. I'd destroyed my marriage for this man, convinced that he represented everything Ray wasn't. And he did. Ray would never have cheated on me. Ray would never have dismissed my feelings. Ray would never have treated our relationship like it was just one option among many. The person I'd become with Joaquin, jealous, insecure, constantly performing to maintain his interest, wasn't someone I recognized. With Ray, I'd been myself, flaws and all. He loved me not because I was perfect, but because I was his. I thought about Ray coming home every day, reliably, predictably, mine. I thought about how he'd light up when I laughed at his terrible jokes, how he'd listen to me vent about work drama without trying to fix it or dismiss it. I thought about how safe I'd felt with him, how valued, how completely accepted. Ray's love had been like air, so constant and reliable that I'd stopped noticing it was there. Only now, suffocating in a relationship built on performance and conditions, did I understand what I'd lost. I'd traded a man who loved me unconditionally for a man who loved me as long as I met his standards. I'd traded security for excitement, depth for glamour, real intimacy for romantic gestures, and I'd convinced myself it was an upgrade. I left Joaquin the next morning, not in a dramatic confrontation. I'd learned my lesson about those, but quietly, while he was at work. I packed my things, left his key on the counter, and drove back to Denver. I'd kept my job at the medical spa, working remotely when possible, so I had some income. But I couldn't afford our old house anymore. Ray had bought it from me during the divorce and was living there with someone new. I found a small apartment across town and tried to rebuild my life. I was 37, starting over with less than I'd had at 25. The friends who had supported my divorce now seemed uncomfortable around me, like failure might be contagious. The excitement I'd felt about my new life had curdled into regret so sharp it took my breath away. I threw myself into work, picked up extra shifts, tried online dating. But every man I met felt like a pale imitation of either Ray or Joaquin. They were either too safe or too risky, too predictable or too unreliable. I'd recalibrated my expectations so many times that I no longer knew what I actually wanted. The hardest part was running into Ray around town. Denver's not that big, and we'd lived here together for years. I'd see him at the grocery store, at the gas station, once at a restaurant with Carol. He was always polite, always kind. But he looked at me like I was a stranger. The warmth that used to be there whenever he saw me, that little spark of joy that said, "There's my person," was gone forever. I'm 38 now, and I've learned some hard truths about love and marriage and what we actually deserve in life. The biggest one is this: we don't deserve anything. We get what we nurture, what we protect, what we choose to value day after day. Ray wasn't perfect. He was predictable and sometimes boring and more interested in fixing the neighbor's furnace than planning romantic getaways. But he was faithful and kind and present. He loved me when I was difficult, when I was ungrateful, when I was too blind to see what I had. Joaquin was exciting and sophisticated and everything I thought I wanted. But his love was conditional, transactional, as disposable as everything else in his perfectly curated life. He loved me when it was convenient, when I enhanced his image, when I made him look good. I mistook consistency for complacency, mistook security for boredom, mistook real love for settling. I thought I deserved passion without commitment, excitement without sacrifice, romance without the mundane daily work of actually loving someone. The truth is, I didn't deserve better than Ray. I deserved exactly what I got. A man who loved me completely, flaws and all, who would have spent the rest of his life trying to make me happy if I'd let him. I just wasn't wise enough to recognize it. Sometimes I wonder if Ray ever thinks about me, if he ever regrets how things ended. But mostly I hope he doesn't. I hope he's too busy being happy with someone who deserves him to waste time on the woman who was too foolish to appreciate what she had. As for me, I'm still learning how to be alone, how to find meaning in my life that doesn't depend on someone else's validation. Some days are better than others. I've stopped looking for someone to complete me and started working on being complete myself. Maybe someday I'll find love again, real love, the kind that values substance over excitement, commitment over passion. But even if I don't, I'll always have the lesson Ray taught me, even in losing him, that the most precious things in life are often the quietest ones. And that real love isn't about getting what you think you deserve. It's about recognizing what you already have before it's too late to keep it. I had everything I needed. I just convinced myself I deserved better. And that lie cost me the best thing that ever happened to me.